In the vast skies over Europe and the Pacific, where the horizon seemed endless and the thin air tasted of gasoline, cordite, and fear, few aircraft carved their legend with such raw, unapologetic force as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was not elegant like the Spitfire. It was not sleek like the Mustang. And yet, by the time the final chapters of World War II were written, pilots from both Axis powers, German and Japanese alike, had come to dread the unmistakable silhouette of the Jug as it descended upon them with the fury of a steel storm. This is the story of how a machine that looked too heavy to fight, too bulky to maneuver, and too crude to become a legend, rose to become the plane Germany and Japan feared most. To understand the rise of the P-47, you must begin at the heart of its unlikely origin. The aircraft was born not from elegance, but necessity. Early in the war, the United States faced a harsh truth. Its air forces lacked a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory or withstand the brutal punishment of low-altitude ground attack. Europe and the Pacific were vast, merciless theaters. Weather, terrain, and enemy fire combined to create an arena where only the strongest machines survived. Republic Aviation, known for building durable but unremarkable aircraft, set out to change that. Under the leadership of Alexander Kartveli, an aviation designer who had fled the horrors of Europe, the company attempted something no one had done before: create a fighter around the most powerful engine America could produce. That engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial monster capable of pushing steel through the sky with the force of a hurricane. But such an engine demanded a large frame, heavy armor, oversized guns, and enormous internal structures to house turbo superchargers and ductwork. The result, when the prototype finally rolled out, was a beast that dwarfed every fighter before it. It looked like a bomber that had dreams of being a fighter. Even test pilots doubted it. And yet, when the wheels left the ground for the first time, something extraordinary happened. The Jug climbed faster than expected, handled smoother than predicted, and most shocking of all, carried the promise of unmatched survivability. Soon, the war would push the P-47 into combat, and the world would discover what a monster it truly was. In Europe, American daylight bombing campaigns were struggling. B-17s and B-24s flying deep into Germany were being torn apart by Luftwaffe fighters. The losses were unsustainable. Escort fighters like the P-38 and early P-51s lacked range or reliability. Morale was bleeding out with every mission.
And then the P-47s arrived. Their early range was limited, but their performance at medium to high altitudes exceeded every expectation. German pilots climbing into their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s soon learned that the new American fighter could die faster than anything they had ever seen. In air combat, altitude was life, and the P-47 owned the sky above 20,000 feet. German aces were stunned by the American strategy. P-47 pilots would climb to immense heights, fly in massive formations, and use diving attacks, boom and zoom, to strike like hawks from the sun. They would plunge toward their targets with terrifying speed, unleash 8.50 caliber machine guns, and escape before the enemy could retaliate. 8.50 caliber guns. No other fighter in the world carried such devastating firepower. The combined weight of the bullets fired in a single 3-second burst was enough to shred armor plates, rip wings apart, and detonate fuel tanks. German pilots, experienced and proud, suddenly faced an opponent that could kill them before they even saw it. The Luftwaffe began calling the P-47 their Eiserne Vogel, the Iron Bird. What made the Thunderbolt even more terrifying was its ability to absorb damage. Pilots returned with wings filled with holes, engines coughing smoke, hydraulic systems shattered, and entire control surfaces blown away. and yet the aircraft refused to fall. If a pilot kept fighting, the Jug kept flying. Stories spread through Luftwaffe units of German pilots unloading their guns into P-47s, only to watch the American monster continue climbing like a wounded bear refusing to die. But Europe was only half the story. In the Pacific, the P-47 confronted a radically different enemy, one built on agility, maneuverability, and close-quarters dogfighting. The Japanese Zero was lightweight, ultra-maneuverable, and flown by pilots trained from childhood to master aerial combat. Early in the war, the Zero had achieved near-mythical status. No Allied fighter could match it in a turning contest. But the P-47 did not need to turn. It changed the rules of engagement. Japanese pilots quickly learned that the Thunderbolt was not a machine you fought up close. It was a machine you feared from afar. Because when a P-47 fired its 8.5 caliber guns, the sky seemed to erupt in flame. Entire bursts tore through fragile Japanese aircraft like paper. One Pacific pilot wrote, "When you fired the P-47's guns, you didn't aim, you erased." In the Pacific environment, humid, hot, and unforgiving, the rugged construction of the Jug became a decisive advantage. Its radial engine, unlike inline engines used by many fighters, could absorb tremendous damage without catastrophic failure. Ground crews loved it because it kept flying no matter how brutal the conditions. Pilots loved it because the aircraft took blows that would kill any other fighter. And the enemy feared it because once a P-47 spotted you, escape was nearly impossible. Whether in Europe or the Pacific, the Thunderbolt dominated through a combination of altitude, firepower, speed in a dive, and unimaginable durability. It could escort bombers, dive bomb targets, strafe armored columns, and attack ground positions with rockets and bombs. It became a Swiss Army knife of destruction, capable of changing roles within minutes. By late 1944, P-47s were destroying German trains, tanks, convoys, and supply lines with such ferocity that some Wehrmacht units refused to move during daylight hours. The Thunderbolt became the iron hammer of Allied ground support, tearing apart everything from panzer divisions to entrenched infantry. No machine gun, no flak burst, no weather conditions seemed capable of stopping it. Germany, already exhausted and strained, now faced a predator they could neither outrun nor outgun. And in the Pacific, Japanese troops began calling the aircraft Raigen's Iron Fist, the fist of the Thunder God. They believed the P-47 descended like a storm sent from the heavens, its guns roaring like divine thunder. But the truth behind the P-47's fearsome reputation was not only the machine itself, it was the men who flew it. American pilots flying Thunderbolts grew into some of the most confident aviators of the war. They trusted their aircraft completely. They pushed it into dives that would tear the wings off other fighters. They returned from missions with fuel tanks dry, engines burning oil, and holes big enough to climb through. And still, they came home. The Jug became a symbol of invincibility, not because of propaganda, but because the pilots who flew it lived to tell the tale. And it is in those tales, those clashes in the sky, those duels above Europe, those desperate battles over the Pacific, that the legend of the P-47 was forged.
The P-47's reign as a feared presence over Europe did not come from a single breakthrough, but from a convergence of engineering, industrial might, and the combat intuition of pilots who learned, sometimes violently, how to unleash its full power. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces were gone, its training pipeline shattered, and its fuel reserves nearly depleted. Yet even in this weakened state, German pilots retained a lethal instinct for survival. And when they spotted contrails high above, thick, white, rolling like brush strokes across the sky, they knew one thing: Thunderbolts were coming. Unlike many Allied fighters, the P-47 could dive into combat from extreme altitude without tearing its wings off. German Me-109s and FW-190s might climb faster, turn tighter, or strike with agility, but the Jug possessed a lethal vertical advantage. It dropped like a meteor. Pilots called it the Jug dive, the moment when a P-47 folded its nose downward and fell at speed so high that German aircraft risked structural failure if they tried to follow. The Germans had seen these dives before. They had lost good men trying to mimic them. But what terrified the most was what the Jug did after the dive. The 8.50 caliber guns, arranged in perfect symmetry across the wings, unleashed a volume of fire unmatched by any other American fighter of the war. A 3-second burst threw roughly 50 rounds per second from each wing, a river of lead dense enough to shred fuselages, wings, engines, canopies, and anything else unfortunate enough to cross its path. Veteran German pilots said that once a Thunderbolt opened fire, the sky itself seemed to spark. It wasn't only fighters that feared the Jug. German ground commanders grew to hate the shape of its wings, the unmistakable rumble of its radial engine, and the sound of rockets splitting the air. Because unlike many fighters, the P-47 evolved, not just as an escort fighter, but as a ground attack monster. By the end of 1944, P-47 groups were knocking out trains, flattening troop columns, smashing armored vehicles, and slicing supply lifelines across France and Germany. Wehrmacht troops referred to Thunderbolt attacks as rolling thunderstorms, a phrase that captured both dread and inevitability. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japanese pilots were discovering an even harsher truth. Their Zeros and Oscars, brilliant designs of agility and lightness, simply could not compete with the Jug's mass, firepower, and durability. A Zero could outturn anything, but it could not outrun the Jug, and it certainly could not absorb punishment like the Jug. The Japanese fighter doctrine had been built on the idea that pilots must not get hit at all. The Thunderbolt was built on the idea that it could take hits and then respond with overwhelming force. That shift, lightness versus survivability, became a cultural clash in the skies. Japanese pilots had always relied on maneuverability, on acrobatics, on the belief that the best defense was flawless evasion. But the Jug forced a different kind of fight. It initiated combat on its own terms, using altitude, speed, and controlled aggression. Japanese pilots who survived early encounters reported that the P-47 didn't behave like a fighter, it behaved like a flying battleship. It attacked with a fury they had not encountered before, attacks that left no room for traditional dogfighting, only for escape. And even escape was difficult. As the Pacific War intensified, Thunderbolts roared over New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually the Japanese home islands, escorting bombers, strafing airfields, and grinding down Japan's remaining air power. Every month, more squadrons arrived. Every month, more pilots mastered the unique advantages of the Jug. And every month, Japan's dwindling air fleet shrank further. In both hemispheres, the P-47's reputation grew into something more than a statistic or a technical comparison. It became a psychological weapon. German soldiers sketched its silhouette in their letters home. Japanese pilots warned rookies to avoid engaging it unless absolutely necessary. The Jug was not merely feared for its capabilities, though those were immense. It was feared because it signaled that the enemy had reached a level of industrial and tactical momentum that no Axis pilot could reverse. And still, the Jug's story was far from over.
Yet the most decisive chapter in the Jug's legend unfolded not in the cloud layer battles, but in the brutal, grinding war against Axis industry itself. By mid-1944, Allied strategy depended on a simple but devastating principle: destroy the enemy's ability to wage war. And for that mission, the Thunderbolt was unmatched. P-47 fighter groups began receiving advanced bomb sights, new rocket rails, and iron bombs that turned the aircraft into a precision strike platform. Factories in Germany that once operated under the illusion of safety, protected by distance, flak, and fighter screens, suddenly found themselves exposed to a new threat. Thunderbolts could dive through flak with terrifying speed, drop ordnance, and climb back out before AA batteries could find the right altitude. Train yards, oil refineries, munitions depots, and railway hubs were hit repeatedly. Each strike weakened Germany's ability to fuel tanks, manufacture aircraft, or move troops to the front lines. Even hardened Luftwaffe officers, admitted that they feared Thunderbolt attacks more than they feared medium bombers. The Jug didn't just appear, it hunted. It flew low, it struck with precision, and its pilots developed a reputation for relentless aggression, attacking until every last target was neutralized or the aircraft ran dry on ammunition. The very concept of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war Germany had used to dominate Europe, was turned back against them. The Jug became the lightning. But what elevated the P-47 from effective to legendary was how it earned the trust of its pilots. Thunderbolt pilots survived hits that would have disintegrated lighter fighters. Stories circulated through Allied airfields. Stories of Jugs coming home with wings shredded, engines punctured, tail sections nearly severed, and still managing to bring their pilots back alive. One pilot landed with more than 200 holes in his fuselage. Another limped home with an entire cylinder blown out of the radial engine. Ground crews shook their heads, marveling that the machine stayed airborne at all. This reputation built a bond not often seen between pilots and their aircraft. Men trusted the Jug to protect them, and in return, they flew it with a confidence that bordered on ferocity. When a pilot believes his aircraft will survive nearly anything, he fights differently. He dives deeper. He stays longer over a target. He pushes limits other pilots would never dare approach. The Axis could not replicate this dynamic. German fighters were swift but fragile. Japanese fighters were elegant but defenseless. Their designs relied on avoiding damage altogether. The P-47's philosophy was different: endure, retaliate, and overwhelm. By late 1944, Thunderbolt groups were operating like airborne cavalry, smashing every obstacle in the path of advancing Allied armies. In France, Belgium, and later Germany, retreating Wehrmacht units reported that even small columns were being stalked by prowling Jugs overhead. A tank division that once moved boldly now shifted only at night. Supply trucks hid under trees and bridges. Troop transports scattered the moment they heard a distant radial engine approaching. In the Pacific, Japan faced the same brutal reality. As infantry fought island by island, the Jug became a flying hammer, breaking Japanese defensive lines, launching rockets into caves, and ripping apart strongpoints that Marines struggled to approach. On Luzon, Okinawa, and in dozens of lesser-known battles, Thunderbolt pilots flew sortie after sortie, often returning only long enough to rearm before diving into the fight again. And as the war pressed towards its end, another transformation occurred, one that cemented the Jug's place in aviation history. The P-47, initially designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, had become the cornerstone of Allied air-ground strategy. No other aircraft of the war demonstrated such versatility: bomber escort, dogfighter, interceptor, tank buster, train hunter, and close air support platform. It had evolved into something far more than Republic aviation ever imagined. For Axis forces, this evolution was a nightmare. Every adaptation they made, new tactics, new dispersal patterns, new camouflage, was countered by another wave of Jug innovation. Japanese Zeros attempted high-angle attacks. German FW-190Os tried slashing dives. None of it changed the outcome. The Jug was simply too fast, too tough, too armed, and too numerous. By 1945, the symbol of Allied air dominance was not sleekness or aerodynamics. It was mass. It was ruggedness. It was unstoppable pressure from skies that never seemed to rest. It was the thunder of the P-47.
As the war drew closer to its final, chaotic chapters, the Jug's presence in the skies became not just common, but constant. Day after day, an unending rotation of P-47 squadrons patrolled the airspace over collapsing Axis territory. German commanders noted bitterly that every attempt to regroup, every movement of armor, every retreating column, and every supply convoy faced one recurring threat: the heavy shadow passing overhead, followed by the deafening roar of 8 Brownings, unleashing another torrent of steel. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, the P-47 played a decisive role. When winter weather cleared and Allied aircraft could once again fly, Thunderbolts descended on German armored spearheads with unmatched fury. Tiger tanks, once feared across Europe, found themselves hunted by rockets and armor-piercing .50 caliber fire. Panzer crews watched in disbelief as their thick steel plates, armor that could shrug off smaller calibers, shattered under coordinated P-47 attacks. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and starved of fuel, could no longer protect its ground forces. Whenever the clouds parted, German troops faced a reality they could not escape. If a Jug spotted you, you were already in trouble. Across the continent, morale shifted. Allied infantry saw the P-47 as a guardian angel. German soldiers saw it as an executioner in the sky. The psychological effect was enormous. Commanders reported that even the rumor of Thunderbolts operating nearby caused German units to scatter, hide, or delay movement entirely. Strategic mobility, once the core of German doctrine, was crippled by the constant threat of aerial attack. At the same time, halfway across the world, the Pacific War entered its bloodiest stage. Japan, no longer able to amass its air power, resorted increasingly to desperate tactics. Kamikaze attacks surged, defensive lines hardened. Yet everywhere, the Jug responded with its trademark combination of strength and relentless pressure. On Okinawa, P-47s flew sortie after sortie, hammering artillery positions, neutralizing fortifications, and sweeping the skies clear of interceptors. Thunderbolt groups adapted to the Pacific environment, operating from rough airstrips carved out of jungle and volcanic rock. Whether escorting bombers to Formosa, striking shipping lanes, or knocking out coastal defenses, the Jug proved that its reputation for toughness was not limited to Europe. And still, the aircraft continued to evolve. Engineers at Republic Aviation refined fuel mixtures, improved turbochargers, and experimented with new payload configurations. The P-47N model, featuring longer wings and increased fuel capacity, enabled the Jug to escort bombers over the vast expanses of the Pacific, missions once thought impossible for such a large, power-hungry fighter. With these modifications, the Jug pushed deeper into Japanese-held airspace, extending the reach of American air power into areas where Japanese defenses were already stretched to the limit. By now, Japan's once feared Zero had become tragically outdated. Pilots still flew with courage, often with a fatalistic acceptance of their odds, but the technological gap was insurmountable. A Zero could outturn a Jug in a perfect vacuum, but war was not fought in sterile conditions. The Jug controlled altitude, it controlled energy, it controlled engagement distance, and ultimately, it controlled the rhythm of the fight. All the agility in the world meant little when the enemy arrived faster, struck harder, dove steeper, and survived longer. When American bomber streams began approaching the Japanese home islands, Thunderbolts flew ahead, sweeping the skies before them. Japanese defenders scrambled with what remained of their fighter wings, many flown by inexperienced pilots with only minimal training. Veterans were scarce, fuel was scarce, even spare parts were scarce. But one thing was not scarce: fear. Fear of the thunderous radial engine. fear of the 8 gun barrels glinting under the sun, fear of the dive that no Japanese fighter dared follow. The P-47's presence became a signal. The war was turning. Japan and Germany, the 2 great Axis air powers, had gone from hunters to the hunted. Their pilots, once symbols of national pride, were pushed into defensive roles they could not win. Their factories lay in ruins, their supply networks collapsed, their skies darkened not from clouds, but from Allied formations that filled the horizon. Even after the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter, the Jug never faded into irrelevance. In many roles, it remained the first choice. Ground attack, interdiction, close air support, anti-armor sweeps, train bustin', road interdiction. These were not glamorous missions. They were not the stuff of fighter ace legends. But they won wars. And they showcased the essence of the Thunderbolt. It was a weapon of pressure, unrelenting, overwhelming pressure. No other aircraft embodied America's wartime industrial strength so perfectly. The Jug did not rely on finesse. It did not require acrobatic maneuvers. It did not win by elegance. It simply combined brute power, engineering resilience, mass production, and firepower into one unstoppable platform. By 1945, Axis forces no longer asked how to defeat the Thunderbolt. They asked how to survive it. And increasingly, they found no answer.
As Germany crumbled and Japan fought on in desperation, the P-47's final wartime legacy began to take shape, not in a single battle or dramatic duel, but in the quiet, relentless mathematics of air superiority. Every convoy destroyed, every train derailed, every tank immobilized, every airfield cratered. These were the thousands of small victories that, together, determined the fate of nations. By early 1945, the Axis powers were fighting inside shrinking boundaries, under a sky they no longer controlled. Thunderbolt units swept across the horizon like an airborne tide. Each squadron carried the weight of Allied momentum on its wings. Each mission pushed Axis logistics one step closer to paralysis. When Allied generals advanced, they did so knowing the Jug had already softened the battlefield, smashed the bridges, destroyed the roads, and disrupted enemy reinforcements before they ever reached the front. For German infantry trapped in pockets along the Rhine, the sound of thunderbolts marked the end of any hope for relief. Fatigued soldiers crouched in trenches and shattered farmhouses, staring skyward as the deep bellow of radial engines grew louder. Veterans whispered warnings to new recruits. If you hear the whistle of a diving Jug, it is already too late. Anti-aircraft gunners fired desperately into the sky, but the Thunderbolt's rugged frame, its thick armor plating, massive radial engine, and redundant controls absorbed hits that would have obliterated lighter fighters. Even when damaged, the Jug kept coming, firing, diving, climbing, hammering retreating columns until there was nothing left but smoke and silence. In the Pacific, this same pattern emerged across island chains littered with caves, bunkers, and brutal defensive lines. Thunderbolts flew at treetop height, strafing jungle trails and crushing fortified positions. Marines advancing across volcanic ash or dense rainforest often watched as P-47s swooped ahead, blasting machine gun nests and eliminating ambushers hidden in cliffs and ravines. On Okinawa, where every ridge seemed defended and every valley a kill zone, the Jug became the spearhead of assault. It cleared the ridgelines, it broke the bunkers, it paved the way for infantry to move forward without being cut down. Japanese troops soon learned to scatter the moment they heard that guttural engine rumbling above the clouds. But even scattering wasn't always enough. The P-47's pilots had sharpened their skills to a razor's edge. They learned to spot camouflage nets, smoke trails, vehicle tracks, and even subtle glints and sunlight off metal. They learned how to fire rockets with uncanny accuracy. They learned how to strike fast, hard, and without hesitation. And as American airfields creeped closer to Japan's mainland, the Thunderbolt evolved once more. The long-range P-47N with extended wings and massive internal fuel capacity enabled operations deep into enemy territory. Now the Jug could escort B-29s on their approach routes, sweep ahead of bombing formations, and dominate the airspace over coastal cities. Even as Japan's defenses collapsed, Thunderbolt pilots showed no complacency. They continued their missions with the same ferocity that had defined the aircraft since its first days in combat. Then, in the final months of the war, something remarkable happened. Something that captured the true essence of the Jug better than any single statistic or victory. The P-47 became a symbol of inevitability. To Japanese pilots, it represented a foe whose industrial base was too vast, whose designs were too advanced, whose pilots were too well trained, and whose aircraft were simply too rugged to stop. The Jug did not rely on luck. It did not rely on surprise. It relied on consistency. Mission after mission, sortie after sortie, the same brutal effectiveness. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, countless Thunderbolts stood lined on airstrips across the Pacific, worn, scarred, oil-stained, but still ready to fly. Many of these aircraft bore dozens of repair patches. Many carried the blackened streaks of flak explosions. Some had bullet holes still visible along the fuselage, and yet they remained intact. They had brought their pilots home. No other fighter in the Second World War embodied the idea of survivability so completely. If the Mustang was elegance, if the Spitfire was grace, if the Zero was agility, then the Thunderbolt was resilience. It was the fighter that came back, the fighter that refused to die, the fighter that overwhelmed its enemies through sheer, uncompromising presence. And for the men who flew it, this reliability forged a bond that lasted a lifetime. Veterans recalled the Jug with a sense of deep respect, sometimes even affection. They spoke of it as a partner, a guardian, a force that stood between them and the chaos of war. Many credited the P-47 with saving their lives on more occasions than they could count. Others simply said it was the toughest thing in the sky. In the end, the reason Japan and Germany feared the P-47 was not a mystery. It was a simple truth written across the war's final years. The Jug changed the rhythm of battle. It changed the psychology of the sky. It changed the fate of every Axis soldier who fought beneath its shadow. The P-47 did not win the war alone, but wherever it flew, the Axis war effort withered. Wherever its engines roared, the enemy retreated. Wherever its guns fired, the outcome became inevitable. The Thunderbolt was not just an aircraft. It was a storm that reshaped the course of World War II and left the legacy etched into every battlefield it touched.